Have you ever wondered why a man grows more obsessed with the woman he couldn't control than the one who gave him everything? There's a silence that follows certain women. It's not emptiness, it's an echo. A haunting. A space he once tried to fill, and now can't forget. He moves on, or at least he pretends to. Dates other women. Smiles for pictures. Shares stories you were never in. But when the nights stretch long and his reflection grows honest, your image returns like smoke under a locked door, uninvited, shapeless, impossible to hold, yet impossible to ignore. You weren't the loudest. You weren't the most eager. But you were different. You saw through him, not just the parts he polished, but the hidden corners he didn't even dare to face himself. And that's what stayed. Carl Jung taught us that the unconscious governs more of our lives than we'd like to admit. That we project our unmet needs, our wounds, and our forgotten selves onto the people we love or think we love. So when he looked at you, it wasn't just desire. It was memory. It was yearning. It was the part of himself he couldn't tame, couldn't fix, couldn't even name. He doesn't think about you because you made him comfortable. He thinks about you because you woke something up inside him that comfort never could. You were not a mirror, clean and flattering. You were a storm. A whisper from the anima, the feminine presence in every man's psyche that beckons him to evolve. And he didn't understand it, not fully. But his soul did. And now that you're gone, something in him trembles. Not because he lost someone obedient, but because he lost the key to something deeper. Something ancient. You see, some women don't just enter a man's life. They enter his unconscious. They plant symbols he can't unsee. Words that echo in quiet moments. Questions that unravel the false armor he's worn for years. You weren't trying to change him. But your very presence threatened every illusion he had built around what it meant to be strong, desirable, in control. You became the wound and the medicine. The ache and the meaning. And now, every woman he meets is quietly compared to the one who didn't need him, who didn't try to fix him, who didn't beg to be chosen. And you, yes, you don't need to reach back. Because he already carries your energy like a scar under his smile. Because the feminine isn't desperate. She invites. And when ignored, she withdraws. Not in bitterness, but in power. She becomes a lesson he must learn when he's ready, not when you need him to. That's the irony. He thought he was in control. That if he ignored you long enough, you'd bend. But real feminine power doesn't bend, it dissolves. It detaches. And in its absence, a man begins to see the truth. He thinks of you in moments he can't explain. When he hears a certain song. When he smells something faintly familiar. When he sees a woman who moves like you do, quiet but full of force. And though he might not name it, his body remembers. Jung spoke of the shadow, the part of us we deny, repress, and exile into the dark. For men, the feminine shadow is often wrapped in shame. Vulnerability. Emotion. Longing. When a woman awakens that shadow, he may reject her not because she's wrong, but because she makes him feel. And feeling is dangerous for the man who's spent his life trying not to. But make no mistake, he is not untouched. You didn't beg. You didn't explain yourself 1,000 times. You didn't fight to stay where you were not cherished. You did the most terrifying thing a woman can do in a world built on male validation, you left. Not in anger. Not in drama. But in wholeness. You walked away without needing to be understood. And that is what he remembers. He can post. He can laugh. He can fall into the arms of the next woman who plays the role well. But somewhere behind his eyes, the storm still lives. The one you brought. The one that called him to confront the very parts of himself he's not ready to meet. And if he ever does the work, real work, shadow work, he'll thank you in the silence of his own transformation. But by then, it may be too late. He tries to forget you with logic. He tells himself it wasn't that deep. That you were just a phase, a passing fascination, a pretty face with inconvenient timing. He convinces himself that if he says it often enough, it will become true. But the body keeps the score, and the soul, his soul, does not lie. This is the battlefield Jung warned us about, not the world outside, but the world within. The man torn between the comfort of his persona and the call of his shadow. Between control and surrender. Between the woman who fits his image and the one who cracks it open. He thinks the ache is about you. That it's your lips, your voice, your softness he misses. But what he really longs for is the part of himself you helped awaken. The one he never knew existed until you mirrored it with your stillness, your knowing, your refusal to be less than whole. Because a woman who has done her own shadow work is not easy to love. She doesn't chase. She doesn't cling. She won't beg for breadcrumbs. She has sat with her demons and no longer fears abandonment because she does not abandon herself. And when a man feels that kind of presence, it terrifies him more than any threat. Because it means he cannot lie. Not to her. Not to himself. And so, he performs. He posts the illusion of moving on. Laughs too loudly in rooms that feel too empty. Replaces depth with distraction. He doesn't talk about you, not to anyone. Not even in therapy, if he goes. Because naming you would mean admitting something real. And real requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is a luxury he's spent years denying. Yet in his quiet moments, you return. Not always as a vision or a memory, but as a sensation. A tightness in his chest. A flicker of shame when another woman asks him a question you once asked without words. A fleeting pain when he realizes no one else sees him quite like you did. And that maybe, deep down, he never wanted to be seen at all. Because to be seen is to be known. And to be known is to risk rejection, not of the mask, but of the man beneath it. That boy who was never enough. That man who still isn't sure who he is when he stops performing. You didn't ask for more than he could give. You simply existed beyond what he was ready to receive. And that's what haunts him. You weren't difficult. You were clear. You weren't demanding. You were deep. You weren't withholding. You were whole. And when a man meets a woman who is whole, she activates the part of him that knows he is not. And he cannot forget that. He might say it wasn't love. That he never really cared. But look deeper. Look at the women who followed. Look at how he chose them. Softer, maybe. Safer. Ones who didn't ask questions. Ones who made him feel like the hero again. Because when he was with you, he wasn't the hero, he was human. And that was unbearable. So he returns to comfort. To the illusion of control. To women who adore him but don't challenge him. Who reflect the version of himself he already believes. Not the one waiting to be born. But every man, eventually, must face the mirror. The real one. Not the mirror of applause, but the mirror of silence. The kind a woman leaves behind when she walks away from being misunderstood. That's the moment his real journey begins if he's brave enough to walk it. And you? You don't need to wonder if he remembers. He does. You don't need to question your impact. It's carved into him. Not by force, not by manipulation, but by presence. A presence that dared to be full without his permission. And whether he ever admits it or not, he was changed. The anima doesn't speak in words. She speaks in symbols. In dreams. In longings that don't make sense to the conscious mind. She is not the woman he possesses, she is the one he cannot forget. The one who, through her absence, calls him back to himself. And so he carries you. In the ache behind his laughter. In the silence between relationships. In the moment he looks into another woman's eyes and sees everything you once reflected, and everything he wasn't ready to hold. There is a cruelty in timing, but there is a divinity in consequence. When a woman like you exits a man's life, she doesn't slam the door. She simply vanishes, quietly, completely, and with a grace that doesn't beg for notice. And it's that stillness, that dignified detachment, that follows him more closely than a screaming exit ever could. Because you were never performing. Your softness wasn't bait. Your mystery wasn't manipulation. You were simply in tune with yourself, with life, with the unspoken laws of energy. And that's something most men don't recognize until they're haunted by the echo of it. Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life and you will call it fate. That's where he is now, trapped between what he chose and what his soul knows he lost. He cannot articulate it. He doesn't have the language. He just knows there's a hollowness. A lack of depth. A feeling that something important slipped through his fingers when he wasn't paying attention. And that something was you. But what does it mean to be unforgettable? It's not about beauty. Not about charm. It's not even about love, at least not the romantic kind. It's about resonance. You struck a chord in him that hadn't been played before. And now, everything else sounds off-key. He can't name it, but his body reacts. His dreams react. His triggers react. Because you weren't just a woman, you were a catalyst. You made him confront things he wasn't ready to see. You held up a mirror, not of perfection, but of reflection. A mirror that showed the fractured boy inside the man. And when he realized you wouldn't mother him, wouldn't coddle his wounds in exchange for crumbs, he withdrew. He labeled you too much or too distant. Not because you were, but because he wasn't enough for himself. He may not remember your last conversation, but he remembers how you made him feel in the quiet moments. The way your presence didn't demand anything but offered everything. You weren't loud with your expectations. You were silent with your standards. And silence is what teaches men the most after the noise dies down. So what does he do now? He dates. He distracts. He becomes a tourist in his own life, moving from one surface to another, hoping to find you in someone else. But the energy is never the same. Because he's not searching for you, not really. He's searching for who he was becoming when he was with you. And until he earns that version of himself, no woman will feel like enough. That's the tragedy. But also the justice. Because men think forgetting is power. They think silence is revenge. But in truth, forgetting is a wound. Silence is surrender. And every woman who has evolved past her need for validation knows this. When you no longer need him to remember, he never stops remembering. That's how the feminine works. She moves like water, not fire. She doesn't destroy. She erodes. Slowly, endlessly, with a grace that turns mountains into dust. And when she's gone, the landscape is never the same. He builds cities over that loss. He pretends the sea never carved through his bones. But late at night, when he's alone with his unspoken questions, he feels the emptiness again. Jung would call it a return to the self, a confrontation with the unintegrated anima, the part of the male psyche that holds feeling, intuition, and soul. You awakened that anima in him. And he fled, not because it was wrong, but because it was real. He wasn't ready. But readiness was never your responsibility. You were there, fully. You offered without chasing. You loved without losing yourself. And when it became clear that he couldn't meet you there, you left, not with bitterness, but with wisdom. And now, he walks through a world that no longer fits the way it once did. The food doesn't taste the same. The music doesn't move him the same. The victories feel muted. Because he knows, consciously or not, that he once stood before a sacred fire and turned away. And you? You became the myth. The echo. The sacred ghost. The woman he doesn't talk about, but thinks of when he's most honest. Not because you left, but because you didn't come back. And that silence, your silence, is the sound of a lesson beginning. He tries to silence the memory by rewriting the narrative. Tells himself you were cold. That you didn't feel it the way he did. That maybe it was all just chemistry, a momentary high, something that only seemed profound because he was vulnerable. But deep down, where words cannot reach and reason cannot lie, he knows better. You didn't just enter his life, you cracked it open. The feminine, when embodied in her full depth, isn't always gentle. She is not a fairy tale. She is not soft edges and whispered compliments. She is transformation. The storm that tears down the false self. The mirror that shows the man who he could be if he's willing to let the ego die. But the ego doesn't go quietly. It rages, it mocks, it resists. It whispers lies that keep him tethered to comfort. She's too independent. She'll never need you. She didn't love you like you loved her. Yet something inside him flinches when he repeats it. Because if any of it were true, he wouldn't still feel you. Not this long after. Not this deep. It's not that he misses your body. It's not even that he misses your presence. What he can't escape is the experience of himself that he had in your orbit. The awakening. The stirring. The realization that there was more to feel, more to know, more to become. And now, without you, that part of him has no place to live. It aches like a phantom limb. He touches other women but doesn't feel seen. He hears their laughter but it doesn't reach him. He plays the same old roles but they no longer bring him joy. Because once a man has tasted soul, ego will never satisfy him again. But he'd never admit that. Not out loud. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So he performs, smiles at the right moments, laughs when he should. He flirts. He flattens his depth into small talk. He tells himself he's fine. But in the pauses, in the liminal spaces where the truth always hides, your name still echoes. Not spoken. But felt. That's the thing about the woman who moves from her essence. She does not need to be remembered to remain unforgettable. Her impact doesn't live in photos or texts or artifacts. It lives in energy. It lives in contrast. In the way life becomes colorless after her. In the way he starts noticing how numb he's become. And in this numbness, something ancient stirs. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming whole. But to walk that path, a man must first descend. Into sorrow. Into regret. Into the shadows he once blamed you for triggering. Only then can he reclaim the pieces of himself he buried before you even arrived. You see, it was never really about you. It was about himself, seen through your gaze. That sacred feminine gaze that holds but never clings. That reflects but never distorts. That witnesses not the mask, not the myth, but the man. Naked. Afraid. Beautiful. And when you withdrew, you didn't abandon him. You invited him. To rise. To reach. To remember. But only he can decide whether he will answer. Some men will never return to that calling. They will armor up, go colder, chase women who demand less. They will retreat into ego, into performance, into a life half-lived. And others, rare few, will fall apart. Will let the pain teach them. Will let your absence lead them into their own becoming. But your role is not to wait. Not to wonder. Not to circle around his indecision like a bird looking for signs. Your role was never to finish his journey. Your role was to awaken it. And you did. Now, the woman you are becoming, the woman who does not beg to be understood, who walks with both her shadow and her light, who holds herself with the reverence of a temple, she no longer waits for echoes. She doesn't crave closure. She is closure. Because she knows, the man who is meant to meet her will not be intimidated by her silence. He will bow to it. And until then, she walks forward. Alone, yes. But never lonely. Because once a woman meets herself fully, she becomes the kind of presence no man can forget even if he spends a lifetime pretending he has. There is a point in every man's story when the masks no longer fit, when the applause no longer soothes, when the women he used to impress feel like echoes of a life he no longer recognizes. It comes slowly at first, fatigue, restlessness, the quiet sense that something vital is missing. But then the dreams start. The memories he didn't invite. The moments he pretended didn't matter suddenly replay themselves in vivid color. And you are there. Not angry. Not weeping. Not begging to be remembered. You're just present as you always were. With eyes that see past what he shows. With energy that doesn't beg for love, but demands reverence. You appear in the threshold of his psyche not as punishment, but as invitation. Not to return to you, but to finally meet himself. Jung would say this is the call of the self, the moment when the ego begins to crack under the weight of a soul denied. When the masculine, conditioned to conquer, begins to long for surrender. Not to a woman, but to the truth of who he is beneath the bravado. And that truth was never revealed more clearly than in your presence. You didn't ask him to change. You didn't lecture or explain. You simply were. And in your being, in your stillness, he encountered everything he'd run from: the longing to be held, the terror of not being enough, the shame of past wounds, the unbearable desire to be fully known without being diminished. But he wasn't ready. He needed to win. To control. To make you small enough to manage. Only now, in your absence, he sees how immeasurable you truly were. And you? You've stopped reaching. Not out of anger, but out of evolution. You no longer lower your frequency to be understood by men who haven't faced themselves. You no longer offer softness to hands that tremble in fear of what they might crush. You don't need to be seen, because you have seen yourself. And that's the kind of power no man can take away. He can forget your birthday. He can delete your photos. He can rewrite the story in a way that flatters his choices. But none of that erases the imprint you left on his nervous system. None of that unbinds the way your gaze lives under his skin. None of that stops him from hearing your silence at the exact moment he pretends he's fine. He will hear your name in places it's never spoken. He will taste your absence in kisses that lack soul. He will search for pieces of you in women who are easier, safer, more available, but never quite right. Because you were not meant to be replaced. You were meant to be remembered. Somewhere in the depths of his psyche, he knows this. He may not have the words, but the ache is undeniable. And that ache is a message: become the man who is worthy of her. But again, that is not your burden. It never was. You are not the mother who waits. You are not the muse who inspires from the sidelines. You are the sovereign. The storm. The still lake. The sacred mystery he was too afraid to hold. And now that you're gone, he is left with echoes. And echoes do not lie. So while he stumbles through the illusions of healing, you rise. You rise into wholeness. Into a silence that roars. Into a presence that says, I will not explain my worth to a man who could not see it when it was offered without price. You walk in your own lane, unbothered by validation, untouched by his awakening or his delay. Because you've realized something he never did. The woman who becomes her own mirror does not chase reflections in others. You let him go without slamming the door, and that is why it haunts him. You didn't leave to punish him. You left to protect your peace. And that peace is now your home. Your temple. Your compass. And if he ever returns, truly returns, it won't be with a handful of promises. It will be with the scars of his own becoming. With eyes that finally see. With hands that no longer tremble at the weight of your truth. And until then, he will carry your absence like a ghost with no name. Like a hunger no one else can feed. Because the feminine he ignored has become the woman he will never forget. There comes a moment, quiet, unmarked, uncelebrated, when you stop waiting. Not just for him, but for anyone. It is not resignation. It is not bitterness. It is a return. To yourself. To the woman you were before you shaped yourself to fit into someone else's unfinished story. This is the rebirth that comes after silence. Not the silence that punishes, but the silence that purifies. The silence that says, I no longer need to be heard by the ones who cannot see me. The kind of silence that radiates power not because it is loud, but because it does not explain. And while he may one day whisper apologies in the dark, while he may come to know the weight of what he lost, that knowing is his path to walk. Alone. In the same quiet you once stood in, hoping he would meet you there. But you no longer linger at the threshold. You have stepped through. Because here's the truth, the woman who has done her inner work does not orbit a man's awakening. She does not water seeds he refuses to plant. She does not dim her light to soothe his shadows. She becomes the storm and the sanctuary, untouchable, unrepeatable, unshakably whole. Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And you, beloved, have claimed that privilege. You walked through fire without turning into ash. You stared into the eyes of your own fear, your own abandonment, your own longing, and you did not flinch. You learned to hold your own ache like a mother holds a child, fiercely, tenderly, without shame. You stopped needing his closure, his clarity, his recognition. Because you found your own. And now, if he dreams of you, and he does, it is not just you he misses. It is the version of himself that only existed beside your truth. It is the man he might have become if he had chosen courage over comfort, presence over pride, depth over distraction. But that choice is no longer yours to carry. You are not a second chance. You are not a lesson wrapped in flesh. You are not a reward for someone else's delayed evolution. You are a mirror for the divine. And when a man cannot see his reflection in your stillness, it is not your duty to shatter for him. Let him live with the ache. Let him make meaning from the silence. Let him build temples from the ruins of your absence. That is how men grow, through loss, through longing, through the women who loved them with their eyes open. You loved him with your eyes open. And now you love yourself with eyes that see even deeper. This is the feminine in her final form, not demanding, not performing, not waiting. Simply being. Whole. Rooted. Sacred. So when you walk now, it is not away from him, it is toward yourself. And with each step, you call back every piece of your power. You no longer shrink to be held. You no longer bend to be chosen. You rise. And if he ever catches a glimpse of you again, truly sees you, it will not be because you lingered in his shadow. It will be because you became the light he never learned how to stand in. Because in the end, the most unforgettable woman is not the one who stays to be understood. It is the one who leaves to be free. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.